so much for being here this evening. It's really wonderful to see a lot of very familiar faces in the room and some new ones as well. My name is Brenna Sinanj, for those of you who don't know me, and I work here at the Alliance for Sustainable Colorado. I run the community engagement and programs that we do out of the Alliance here. And it's my honor to welcome you here this evening and to introduce to you our esteemed guest. We also have a lot of VIP attendees in the room, and we like to honor them by name, but looking around, there are so many of you that I think we'd be here listing them for like 10 minutes. So just know that we do really appreciate your attendance. We appreciate your support of the work we do here. Show of hands, who has been to the Alliance Center before? Good, so the majority of you guys. Well, thank you again for coming back and supporting us. I do just want to give you guys a little bit of our history. So for those of you who've been here and sat through my spiel before, apologies, bear with me. The Alliance was built, this building actually was built in 1908. And back then, this was a historic shipping district in the downtown Denver area. And all the trains that came through Union Station actually utilized these buildings as warehouses for storage, and this building was one of those. It went through many iterations over the years. Our current governor actually officed out of here for quite a few years. And the Alliance for Sustainable Colorado purchased this building in 2004. And one of our founders is in the room tonight. Many of you know him. Where's Mr. John Powers? Oh, he's out there. Wave to John. Hi, John. So yeah, we definitely want to recognize John and the other founders who made this organization possible. It's a really wonderful thing to be a part of. Our mission here is to transform sustainability from vision to reality. And we do that through a number of different ways. One of that is actually through the built environment and the building that you're in here now. When we started undergoing renovations, we took a lot of different things into consideration. And of course, human comfort, aesthetics, a shared workspace, all of that was very important to us. But we also focused on the built environment as terms of the ecological impact and sustainability. And through the different renovations, we actually received 3 different rounds of LEED certification. The first round was LEED Silver in one of the first rounds of renovation. The second certification was Gold, and then most recently we are certified LEED Dynamic Plaque. Who's heard of LEED Dynamic Plaque before? Besides in one of my spiels. Okay, so LEED Dynamic Plaque is a new edge of LEED. And typical LEED certification certifies every few years is when buildings have to get recertified. LEED Dynamic Plaque is actually a real-time certification where the building metrics are collected and you can find your score on any of the LEED qualifiers anytime you want to at the touch of a button. And your certification is updated on a monthly basis. So we will have the plaque displayed here coming very soon. It'll be out in the lobby here. And it's something that we're really excited to be on the cutting edge of. There's only a handful of buildings in the country who have received that. And we are one of the only ones that's historic. Most of them are actually a new build, so it's a great achievement for us. We also focus on our mission through our building with our tenants. And the top 4 floors, I always slur when I say that, 4 floors above us are a shared office workspace. And there are 45 nonprofits, actually this week it just jumped up to 45, and 210 individuals that office out of here. And for those of you who know our tenants, you know it's a very esteemed group. We have groups like COSIA, SWEEP, Conservation Colorado, Sierra Club, USGBC, RMI. The list goes on and on. All 40 of them are really amazing. And one of our business theories is that by bringing those groups together and creating a space for them to work, we can scale their efforts and make them more effective at catalyzing the movement in our state and across the country. Another way that we focus on our mission is through our events, is through bringing wonderful people like yourselves to the room today, to have wonderful speakers like Randy Hayes give us his attention in the room this evening. And we also do that through servicing external events. So if any of your groups are looking to meet here, you're looking for a place to collaborate, please let me know. I'd love to help you with that. Another one of the roles I serve is as a community collaborator and figuring out who needs to meet who, what organizations need to be involved with each other to again scale their efforts. So please come talk to me if there's anyone you want to get involved with our building or with our community. I would love to help you with that mission as well. Lastly, to introduce our esteemed guest this evening, Mr. Randy Hayes. He's sitting up here. Randy, and I'm sorry, I'm going to read the biography a little bit just so I don't miss anything because he's had a lot of accomplishments over his career. Randy has been described by the Wall Street Journal as an environmental pit bull. He's the executive director at Foundation Earth, which is a new organization that is rethinking human order and how that works within the planet's life support systems. Such an amazingly important topic, Randy. As a former filmmaker and Rainforest Action Network founder, he's a veteran of many highly visible corporate accountability campaigns and has advocated for the rights of indigenous peoples. He served 7 years as a president of the City of San Francisco Commission on the Environment and as the Director of Sustainability in the office of Oakland Mayor Jerry Brown, who's now actually the state governor. As a wilderness lover, Hayes has explored the High Sierras, the Canadian Rockies, the rainforests of the Amazon, Central America, Congo, Southeast Asia, Borneo, and Australia. He's a special advisor to the World Future Council, and he's also attended many of the COPs over the years, which I'm hoping he'll bless us with some of his stories this evening. According to Adam Werbach, the founder of the Sierra Club, or the former president of Sierra Club, Randy Hayes is a hero and a visionary. He's a radical messenger with the mentality of a Madison Avenue executive who's selling just one thing: saving the world before it's too late. Without further ado, Randy Hayes.
Oh God, you know, you hear those glorious things, and then I look up at the screen and I see the typo that I'm personally responsible. It's not supposed to say placing of the Grand Canyon and so many other things. But I was also recently up in Portland at the Eco Trust has a center of this ilk up there, and they really sort of represent the hubs of bioregional economies. And if I had to have a simplistic vision of how I'd like the world to be, I would see every continent being about 90 to 95% self-sufficient, right? With a network of bioregional economies that traded, continentally. That would give us the diversity for a pretty interesting life without killing the planet. And these kinds of centers, in my mind, sell that bioregional sort of economy vision, which may become even more important than we think of if the world continues to collapse as it does from time to time in terms of human society and our ecological systems. The way I see the future is somewhat of a stair step, but not in a good direction until we create a great ecological U-turn to that more socially just, ecologically sound world that we all seek to have. But like if you think of 2008, right, if we were on a stair step the wrong direction because of our lack of sustainability, we dropped down and now we've leveled off. Well, there's likely to be another drop. And some of them will affect other continents more than one continent more than another, and some of them will be rather global. But that's likely a kind of future. And there's sort of a good news or silver lining part to that negative narrative, which is that it's going to take more shocking of people to want to demand the level of change and to generate the political will for the level of change that we need to have the great ecological U-turn to that level of sustainability. And I actually, if I was asked 15 years ago, I thought we would be there now because of the extreme weather events. The various tornadoes where they didn't occur before, the droughts and the floods and the weirding of the weather. If we'd have had one just before the UN climate change meeting in Copenhagen in 2009, I think things would look very different. If we'd have had a Katrina Category 5 hit the week before that event, I think it would have gone a quite different way. And so I do think there are windows of opportunity where a great change can happen quickly, though we continue to be running out of time, because you can't afford to have slow solutions to fast problems, particularly problems that have such potentially cataclysmic consequences. But how many have been to a climate change meeting, a COP, Council of Parties, or is planning to go to Paris in December? A little higher here, let me get a sense. So we've got five or six of us here. Yeah. All right. Well, they're a bit of a nightmare, so if you're not going, you may be glad about that. On the other hand, it'll be the place to be on the planet probably for those 2 weeks, and this one may pan out better than the last several. We hope. But let me also ask for another hand raising. How many of you think that you're an alarmist? I'm raising my hand. All right, so we have some alarmists in the room. All right. Well, I want to read you a formal definition of alarmist that I wrote. Yeah, which is, and this is a commercial, by the way. This is a commercial advertisement for the new Foundation Earth report. This is America. We should have 2 or 3 commercials during the course of this talk. I'll at least throw one more in for the Alliance Center. But biosphere, smart agriculture, and a true cost economy. Right? We'll get into that a little bit more so. But in it, I've got a little glossary at the back. And it's not your typical glossary. It has definitions for things like advanced nations, systemic thinking, overconsumption, biospheric literacy. But the definition for alarmist is the purpose of an alarm is to wake you up so you can take decisive action. When the house is on fire, an alarm is not unimportant. Right? So, why should we all be alarmists in this room? And I want to encourage you, next time you hear that question, to say, hell yeah, I'm an alarmist, damn it. Because I do believe the house is on fire in quite a number of ways. This slide, if you're not familiar with it, it's because it's relatively recent. It was created in Stockholm, actually, at the Stockholm Resilience Center by a man named Johan Rockström, who was looking at the biosphere and how it supports life. And we can talk about the life support systems of the biosphere, but kind of what does that mean, really? How do you put some flesh to the bones of that sentence? We all kind of on a gut level know what the life support systems of the biosphere are. You need water, and you need food, and you need lots of things. But he put some scientific methodology, and you can break it down differently, but he came up with 9 categories, and they all interrelate, of course. And if any one of them sort of dies, the whole system is quite likely to collapse. And the red, outside of the green, is where we're in trouble, right? This is kind of what he calls the safe operating space. So whether we're dealing with chemical pollution, climate change, ocean acidification, the stratospheric ozone, the nitrogen cycle of the planet, you cannot have photosynthesis without nitrogen, right? You don't want to have zero nitrogen, or you won't have photosynthesis. That would break down the life support systems of the planet. But if you have too much nitrogen, you have things like 400 dead zones in the oceans, right? It's off the friggin' charts because of industrial agriculture. Hence the report that we made, Biosphere Smart Agriculture, available on our website for free. All right, but then the phosphorus cycle is like that, for photosynthesis, but also out of control because of fertilizers and industrial agriculture. And then there's several other categories, but this is biodiversity loss. The web of life, the biodiversity, we cannot have life without a vibrant biodiversity. And this planetary extinction, sixth great extinction, is not acceptable. We really have to grapple with that. If we went to 100% renewable energy overnight throughout the planet, it would not save the planet. And so for the climate change fanatics who are all about stopping coal and oil and gas and going to renewable energy, good for you, keep it up. But don't sell the message that that's enough, because you'll be misleading people, and we don't want to mislead people. Part of my meta message of tonight is, what is the holistic message? How do we sort of embrace, the sort of the whole package of what needs to happen, right? And because we're in more trouble with biodiversity loss than we are with climate change, and we feel, probably the people in this room pretty well feel how serious this one is. It's scary, right? But the nitrogen cycle is also, and these others, they're running. Where you see no red, it's just because they haven't run the numbers. This is a relatively recent sort of concept. But it is the basic conditions that supports life on planet Earth. And we need alarmists because the house is on fire. And our house is on fire from multiple sites. And they all have to be put out. We need the bucket brigades for all of them operating at once if we're gonna save that house, right? So, that's also kind of formally called the Planetary Boundaries. So it's pretty well known in Europe now and other parts of the planet, not terribly well known in the United States yet. It was only kind of created in '09, and they've been refining it. They still don't have all the scientific methodologies and numbers to run the calculations. But it gives us a good tool to begin to assess when we reverse things. There is one global planetary good news item, where one of the life support systems of the planet, the ozone crisis, was largely solved. It is naturally rebuilding itself because we quit putting the worst of the worst, chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, into the atmosphere. You know, there's still some problems to deal with, but some of the planet is self-healing, at least up to a point. And we need to get our foot off the throat of these life support systems if we want to have that great ecological U-turn to this better world, right? So, however, Brenna asked me to give you a history tonight of the climate change meetings, and I will run through that a bit. I'll have to refer to my notes more than usual because it's not the stuff, it's not my Save the Rainforest pitch that I like to give, nor is it my more recent one for the last 3 or 4 years, how do we ecologize capitalism? I think that's a lot of what I talked about last year when I was out here. That's part of the 6-point plan that I mentioned. But I'm not going to start with the history of the Climate Change Convention. I want to go back in time to when we were hunter-gatherers. You know, 99% of human history, we were hunter-gatherers. This is back when I met John Powers. You know. We've been around for a while. You know, see, I'm at the front of the room. He's at the back. We kind of have you tracked. It's an old strategy from the hunter-gatherers era. But yeah, no, it's actually true. 99% of human history, we lived relatively sustainably, right? In decent numbers. You know, there were some problems and extinctions of species, no doubt. But largely, things went wrong about 9,000 years ago. And guess what created really our initial problems? Agriculture. When we stopped living sustainably is when we shifted to agriculture. Does that mean we go back to hunter-gatherer, the Pleistocene? No. It doesn't, you know, but we need to understand something about that and the nature of that generating problems for us, right? But that 99% of human history then led to the last 9,000 years of agriculture, and that's when a lot of the land use changes and deforestation began to occur around agriculture. And the real serious kind of extinction crisis, and our population numbers went from, you know, how many 100 million we were at that time or less than 100 million, excuse me, probably less than 60 million planet-wide, to the 7.4 billion that we are now, or the 9 or 10 or 11 or 12 billion that we may go to, right? But then came about 200 years ago the Industrial Revolution. And, you know, the night's too short for me to go into too much detail about the dilemma of that. But suffice it to say, the internal combustion engine powered by fossil fuels was a really convenient technology shift, right? As was the steam engine powered by coal, right? But there were unintended consequences of those technological shifts. And almost all of our environmental problems are from unintended consequences of technology. And so all you techno-optimists out there, beware. You know, techno-fascination is a disease of the youth that many of us also have. And the unintended consequences really have to be thought about much more so. And there needs to be a whole kind of technology policy around that, and setting up institutions that would analyze technology, the unintended consequences, particularly if some of these geoengineering nightmares begin to take off, as is you know, somewhat likely. You know, so Industrial Revolution 200 years ago, and then World War II, and from World War II to now, we went into this piranha feeding frenzy of the global economy and industrial, you know, growth. And you look at the industrialization of China, the nightmare that that represents, right? That brings us up to sort of modern times, right? But then post World War II, we went into that hyperdrive, and then around the year 1972 was the first global gathering for the Earth, formal UN global gathering, you know, and that was the Earth Summit in Stockholm, as I recall. Yes, not Copenhagen, Stockholm. And I knew about it at the time. I was just graduating college at Bowling Green University in Ohio, and I didn't know it at the time, but I was about to move out out here to the Colorado Plateau and live off and on for the next 10 years with the Hopi Indians, which is where I did my graduate school training in deep long-term sustainability, right? Hanging out with the elders. I was not sort of a shamanic understudy. I was more secretary chauffeur to the elders, helping get them around. More stories about that some other time. But it was a great consequence, and the Hopi do know something about long-term sustainability. They've lived in the Southwest here on the Colorado Plateau for quite a while, and they have their sort of prophecies and their philosophies and understandings of nature. And I learned a lot from that, and they went over to that gathering. Well, that was followed up 20 years later in 1992, and I'm beginning to get into the history of the actual climate change machinations. But 1992 in Rio, Brazil, was the Great Earth Summit. And I had started Rainforest Action Network in 1985, after 10 years, 75 to 85, kind of hanging out with the Hopi. I wanted to switch from the desert to the tropical rainforest. I was just a fanatic for extremes, and that was the shift I made at the time. But I went down there, and George Bush Sr. was our president at the time, and he was running for re-election against eventually Bill Clinton. But Jerry Brown was also running in the primary, in the Democratic primary, and I knew Jerry Brown from Northern California. I worked with him when he was mayor of Oakland as the director of sustainability and that whole green city stuff. But Jerry was down there, and I set up a press conference for him so that we could showcase that there were some people from the United States who thought a little more in a little more integrated fashion than George W. Bush. And his claim to fame at the time was his sort of foreign policy. But we were trying to make the point that saving the planet was foreign policy. That was global policy also, and that he sucked on that particular issue and shouldn't be reelected. I hung a banner while he was giving his speech in the United Nations. Promptly got thrown into a federal prison in Rio. I've been arrested for civil disobedience about 19 times. Trying to kind of make my point. So I'm losing my touch. The night's young, now we'll see. I'm just hoping it's not the drunken disorderly. John will probably make me go drink after this. But I'm subject to peer group pressure. I always have. It's one of my frailties. So now, because this is kind of new material, Brenna, you've got to watch the time, and feel free to stand up and say, hey, you're going on too long.
Yes, sir.
You don't have to be kind, you can be rude, I can handle it.
You got it, Randy.
All right?
We'll arrest you.
All right, I will try to whip through some stuff, and then if there is time, I've got some other fun slides that I can show you from the tropical rainforest, But I'll leave this one on for the moment. Unless you want to go back to the Pleistocene. That, by the way, is a tropical rainforest, still just as intact as this in Bolivia. One of my favorite rainforest shots. So there's a lot out there worth seeing, as we all know. All right, so in '72, they really did have that planetary gathering, and it was of consequence. And Maurice Strong, who lives down in Preston, Colorado, some of the year, and they created UNEP, UN Environmental Program, out of that, and he was the first Secretary General of that. So Colorado has that kind of connection, even though he's really a French Canadian. And people were welcoming here, or something like that. You even let me in from time to time. Right, so, and then '92 was that Earth Summit, and there were 3 treaties that were supposed to happen down there. One on tropical rainforest protection. I was head of the Rainforest Action Network, so championing that. But it got bumped off the agenda. And then there was the Biodiversity Treaty, which did come out of that. And then the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That was the formal treaty between nations that kicked off what we know as the Kyoto Protocol and the upcoming meetings for the next global agreement on climate change. Right? So the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change came out of the '92 thing. And the Tropical Rainforest Treaty got knocked off the agenda because basically the Southeast Asians and the Brazilians raised hell and said, we don't want the North telling us what to do with our rainforests. We want to pillage them for profit. That's what the elites tend to want to do in any country, north, south, east, or west. and they said they want, if there's going to be a forest convention, it's got to be all the world's forests. Well, then Canada and the United States says, well, we don't want you telling us what to do with our forests that we want to pillage. So let's just not have a treaty, and all of those people were happy to say no to that treaty, right? Which was too damn bad. So I raised hell, hung a banner, and went to jail. Seemed like the thing to do, but I got out okay, right? And then that all led, so that was 92, and that led up 5 years later to the meeting in Japan, in Kyoto, beautiful Kyoto. And that's where the Kyoto Protocol came. And that was to begin to give real serious flesh to the bones of the agreement and make it binding in some form or fashion. But at that, just prior to that in the United States, you may recall that virtually 100 senators, that's all parties. We only have 2. Sorry to say, but they all voted that they would not, sign the agreement unless India and China were party to it. Right? That was the dynamic going on at the time. It was a tough one, and we didn't even know at the time if President Carter would send Al Gore or come over himself or send Al Gore even to Kyoto. He did eventually there, but it was not looking pretty at all during that because of that dynamic and pissing fight. And virtually all of these meetings for the last 21 years, since the first one, there's been some kind of behind-the-scenes pissing match. I'll get up to the current one in a minute, or in a couple minutes. But I organized a demonstration at that. I did actually a formal debate with the environmental youth leadership of Japan about the tool of civil disobedience. Is that an effective tool in a place like Japan where they have a different ethic and they have this sort of public friendliness, even though they're happy to pillage the entire planet. They were the sort of the China of the day. They weren't, 75% of Japan is a beautiful forest. It may not be old growth, but it's a beautiful forest. But they were, wiping out Borneo and so many of the tropical rainforests because their economic bubble was going crazy at the time. At any rate, we organized a demonstration at the debate. I formally acknowledged that I lost the debate, but then I asked the audience, which is about twice or 3 times what this was over there, mostly of students, who would like to go across the hall and make a banner for a demonstration and do civil disobedience. Half of the room came over. We did a banner. They came up with a banner, and the banner read, because we had heard the day before that Al Gore was going to fly in the last day. And the U.S. actually did sign that agreement. We just never ratified it in the Senate. Right? But Al Gore was coming to town, and so the big banner in the demonstration, the banner read, Al Gore, read your book. Because the Democrats were not seen as the great ecological saviors that particular week on the planet. Right? But we came out of the Kyoto Protocol with binding targets. And those of you who follow this stuff know that there were Annex 1 countries and not Annex 1 countries, but it was essentially the industrial North had to make binding commitments and the others didn't. And that, and that pissed off, not just the Republicans, but a lot of the elected officials in the Senate. But there was almost zero talk about who created the problem. If you look at what's up there from fossil fuels and deforestation, how much of it was the industrial North's responsibility, versus the South, and it was probably a 95 to 5% ratio difference. Don't quote me on that. But there was a reason why they wanted to be left out. There is a justice issue that they're trying to balance the scales, even though many of the people in the governments of the South I have as much distrust of as I do governments of the North. So I'm an equal, fair person on that issue, I think. Right, but we got the binding targets, and it's not been a pretty picture, but it was a start, and that's not unimportant. Then around 2001 in Bonn, Germany, was the climate change meeting. It's basically just 2 weeks in December every year, usually speaking, right? And all the nations gather and they hash out this stuff, right? And it's torture, but it's necessary, and it's going on. And at the 2001 meeting, the forest as a carbon sink were added. It wasn't just about renewable energy and fossil fuels. They said, okay, well, you know, the scientists reminded them, and the Rainforest Action Network sorts reminded them that about 15% of the annual greenhouse gas emissions are from tropical rainforest destruction. Right, 15% is a big slice of the pie. You know, you cannot stay under 2 degrees centigrade average temperature rise and have a livable Earth if you don't save the rainforest. We have to do that as well as the other things. And they set up this, you know, they started, you know, talking about carbon offsets and the cap and trade program that Europe piloted before other places. And I was arguing for a 3-to-1 ratio for things like carbon offsets. So imagine if a coal-fired power plant is putting off a ton of carbon above its allowable limit, and they want to offset a ton of carbon by planting trees in Guatemala. That to me is not an honorable solution. A 3-to-1 ratio would be honorable, maybe. Where a ton of carbon here, you'd have to sequester, say, 3 tons over there. And that would have gotten a lot of the major environmental groups like the World Wildlife Fund International Network and the Greenpeace International Network and the Friends of the Earth International Network and the World Rainforest Movement International Network. There are about 6 global environmental networks that we were tracking at the time, trying to sell that ratio idea. But it just never caught wind in the sail because, you know, the world of business doesn't want it. You know, and they wield a lot of power. And right. But nonetheless, forests were at least recognized as a carbon sink, you know, which is not unimportant. And then in 2004, let's see, what happened in 2004? Something important. Discussions of the post-Kyoto Protocol agreement. Oh, no, sorry. 2004 is when they started trying to figure out what they're about to do this December in Paris, which is the agreement after the Kyoto Protocol agreement that is supposed to have binding targets. But largely because of the U.S., they've nullified the binding targets, and the governments are showing up with non-binding targets, which is not unimportant. So that's happening, and then came 2007 in Bali in Indonesia, right? And there was every 5 years all the climate scientists do their big mega reports, and as you may know, each one comes out saying the house is on fire more than we thought. It's a bigger fire, it's burning faster, we have less time to solve it. You know, that happens about every 5 years formally. And that happened that year in Bali. Well, it did put some fire under the feet of the negotiators to try to say, well, what constitutes quick action? And so they were hoping from 2007 to the Copenhagen meeting in 2009, which was one of the more important of those series of gatherings, they were hoping in 2009 that they would have this new agreement that we still don't have, and we may get in December, but it won't go into effect for like 5 years after we get it in December. So, you know, we're still screwing around major time in this nightmarish situation. They hoped for that agreement. There was a lot of hope. It was a little bit like there's actually more hope than you might imagine around this Paris thing coming up. And I think there's some reason for that hope. But there was a lot of hope in 2009, and I was over that meeting in Copenhagen. And Obama was, you know, he started in February of 2009, so come December, he was the great white hope, so to speak, that was going to fly in and save the day. And even a lot of Europeans, probably more Europeans than Americans, thought that he was going to save the negotiations because over 2 weeks they weren't going too well, and he was to fly in a day and a half before they ended, and somehow, you know, pull it off and save it. But it was the first great Obama disappointment from that standpoint. I'm not trying to blame him entirely for it all. On the other hand, I'm not happy about it. So that, you know, that happened in 2009. Well, you know, and subsequently the next 3. So Copenhagen was this gigantic global letdown, and there was a pall over the social change community globally, and a lot of governments and people that care and want a solution to this. And it lasted about 3 years. A lot of us finally dug our way out of a fairly deep depression, you know, because that's no fun way to live your life, right? And so The next one was in Mexico, and the one after that, I can't quite remember where the hell it was. But they were not good news items, you know. And now we're going off to Paris. So you know what to expect coming into Paris, right? Well, what we will expect is that the governments will actually sign an agreement. And though the targets that governments make won't be binding, some of them are moderately interesting. I think these figures may not be up to date, but the European Union is trying to cut emissions 40% by 2030. The US and the Obama administration is saying 26 to 28% by the year 25. That's pretty soon, you know, 25. And China will at least peak by the year 2030, and then supposedly start coming down. I think we could see them peak earlier and come down faster, because there's some advantages to an autocratic society in some places. Or it may just come from global economic collapse, which is the only thing that has actually reduced greenhouse gases in any given year. It's the only thing that's literally reduced greenhouse gases was the 08 crisis. It's not an elegant solution, particularly, you know, lots of people in this room probably lost about a third of their retirement savings out of that, right? You know? I mean, even for that, I mean, that's not a disaster. We didn't die the next month. But for other people, it was an even tougher one. So global economic collapse is quite likely to be how this problem gets solved. But it's not an elegant solution. It's not even a semi-elegant solution. It creates, you know, sometimes a whole other set of problems, right? But I mentioned the money fight to some of you in conversations, but not surprisingly, at almost all these meetings, there's some kind of a money fight. And one was between the southern countries and the northern countries, and some of it was kind of a brinksmanship. You know, you want us, you know, you guys created the problem, screw you. If you don't pay us money, we'll call it climate adaptation and mitigation. But if you don't get hordes of money towards us, we're not going to play ball. And others, you know, they mean it from a much more earnest and authentic social justice standpoint that needs to happen, and there's truth to that also. But they're not talking small change. They're talking about, you know, as much as $100 billion a year that would be provided to deal with adaptation and meeting their climate change reduction targets, right? And so that's kind of the big shit fight behind the scenes, is around the money stuff and the brinkmanship that's going on. How that's going to play out in December is really, really hard to tell. But hand in hand over the last couple of years, the United Nations has also come up with something that many of you have heard of, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I wanted to sort of tell you the history of that a little bit, because when I was at the climate change meeting in Durban, you know, what was that year? 11 maybe? Let's say it was 2011. Okay. All right, so in South Africa, or Johannesburg, or Durban, one of the joints. I was down there, and instead of a kind of binding agreement coming out of that meeting, somewhat the United States and other countries said, no, we're going to have the Millennium Development Goals. And that's how the world will organize to solve problems. But the Millennium Development Goals are not largely about solving ecological problems. They're not largely about, you know, protecting these 9 planetary boundaries, right? Or creating the U-turn away from that scenario. They were about, you know, feeding people and things that are quite important. But it really sidetracked people from, you know, we're humans. We're a human species. We are humanistic, which is a good thing to be humanistic, but we're also anthropocentric, where we think too much about our own self-importance, like we're the center of the universe, in the way that people used to think that Earth was the center of the universe. It's not, and neither is our species. Our species is a strand in the web of life, right? And the web can go on without us, but we can't go on without it, right? So those Millennium Development Goals were only set up from that year till 2015, right, which is this year. And to a sense of good news is the name is now the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Well, that phrase, sustainable development, hides a lot of sinful activity of global growth and destruction, right? It's not ecologically sustainable development. it's really sustaining economic growth, and it's environment light and not environment deep green. You know, it's light green, not deep green. But it's a step in the right direction. And those UN Development Goals, there are 17 of them, and 4 of them relate to these planetary boundaries. There's one on fresh water, there's one on biodiversity loss, climate change, and the nitrogen cycle. And so that could be a tool, because governments actually paid attention to the Millennium Development Goals. They actually did get a lot of people out of poverty and a lot of malnourished people up to at least a moderately dignified diet. And that's good. That's important stuff to work. And that's still built into the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but there's much more of the ecological stuff in there. And so maybe when they run out, we'll finally have the deep ecology goals of the planet where we really get the job done, if we haven't cooked ourselves and turned the planet into something like Venus by then. But whether that's likely to happen or not, we're not smart enough to know. David Suzuki said this at an important speech up in Montreal a couple of years ago. His title of his speech was, "Is it too late?" And he essentially said, we're not smart enough to know. These are complicated things. Windows of opportunities may open up. We don't know how much time we have. And so we, at the very least, we want to go down swinging with a plan commensurate to the scale of the problem, which I believe is part of the good news that will come out of Paris, is sort of a better narrative of what that plan commensurate with the scale of the problem is all about. We'll get into that a little bit in a minute or so. But so these UN development goals, there's still things like ending poverty and ending hunger through sustainable agriculture. And what's different at this meeting is agriculture is going to have a much higher profile. It was a little bit over the last couple of years, but it's going to come into play. And the same way forests has come into play, and you can do carbon offsets, and there's a whole system now set up for that. It's a little bit of an unholy strategy, but I don't care if it works. It's basically pay people to not do bad things. That forest carbon, I'm simplifying a lot for those of you who know this, but for those of you who don't know a lot about it, I think the simplicity has a fair amount of truth to it. It's basically paying people to not do bad things. It's called avoided deforestation. So if your trees are already standing and sequestering carbon, you get paid annually if you prove that they're still standing. Right? Now that's one scenario. And there's logic to that because they're getting mowed down. And if this creates a front for the southern perimeter of the Amazon and we save the Amazon through that, it's not my favorite strategy, but I could hold my nose and put up with it if it gets the job done. It hasn't gotten the job done in the last 5 or 7 years, but it still has potential. Like a lot of these solutions, they could be implemented well or implemented poorly, right? And so we may get one that's not at all my favorite cup of tea, but then I think if we do, we ought to throw our shoulders behind that and try to implement it with as much integrity as possible, and we might, in fact, save the day, right? So, but the World Bank, good old World Bank, which used to be the largest bank in the world, but now private banks are the largest banks in the world, and China has set up a development bank that's even bigger than the World Bank and gives out way more money, say, in Southeast Asia than the World Bank, because they don't like us controlling things over here, and they want to control things. And there's all these banking dynamics going on. And that report that my commercial advertisement, is Biosphere Smart Agriculture for a True Cost Economy, recommendations to the World Bank. And it is on the website, Foundation Earth, right? But the World Bank and Food and Agriculture Organization, UNFAO, came up with something called Climate Smart Agriculture. Well, that sounds pretty damn good, huh? Well, it's light green at best. It's a lot of business as usual, industrial agriculture with a lot of GMO stuff, which is scary and not sufficiently tested. There may be GMOs that are just fine, and there's quite likely many that are not just fine. But personally, I just don't want frog genes put in my tomato and things like that. But they are looking at genetically engineered trees and all kinds of things that are quite likely horror stories. And so climate smart agriculture is quite likely to be co-opted and not be a good thing. But not necessarily. The FAO version of it has a fair amount of ecological integrity to it. And what is it that caused the biodiversity crisis? Virtually all of the land cleared right? Forest land's cleared. If we've lost half the forests on the planet, if they are the lungs of the planet and we've lost half, we're now operating on one collapsed lung. That's not too smart. So let's rebuild it. And I'll say more about that. But agriculture caused this, right? What's the #1 greenhouse gas emitter? If you add all of the stuff that's related to greenhouses from agriculture, the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases is agriculture. And the nitrogen runoff is from nitrogen fertilizers. That's virtually all agriculture, as is phosphorus, which is about to go out of the green zone, right? So if we don't deal with agriculture, we're not going to save the planet. Hence why Foundation Earth, is being a tree hugger, shifted over to this agriculture thing, because they say 70% of the new agricultural land will come from tropical rainforest annihilation to create that new land. And that is not okay, right? That's robbing Peter to pay Paul, or something worse. But, and then there are some good things like achieve gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls. That's a UN Sustainable Development Goal, right? And that's sort of code for let's end patriarchy. You know, and on my personal list of the root causes of our social and ecological crisis, and I keep an actual list, there are about 9 things. One of them is patriarchy, right, and anthropocentrism, right? And it's not important. But gender equality, empowering women and girls, is also code talk for dealing with population numbers. So, population is unquestionably a problem. It is by no means the only problem. We all know that per capita consumption is part of that, but also technologies that create problems is part of that. You know, if you want to decrease the impact on the life support systems of the planet, there's an old formula called I equal PAT. People like Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren came up with this. I is the impact on the planet's ability to support life, the basic conditions of life. And there's 3 things you got to deal with. Yes, you got to deal with population numbers. You got to deal with per capita consumption, and you got to deal with those technologies that have those unintended consequences. And if you do all 3 of those, you have 3 parts of a holistic approach and a much greater likelihood of solving the real problem, right? But then, I'm getting through this material. There's not too much more here. Brandon, I don't want you to get too nervous.
You're good.
Okay. And there's water and sanitation for all, and that's an opening to deal with the hydrologic cycle issue. You know, that may or may not help the Colorado Plateau in terms of droughts and floods, you know, because we have already done so much damage. We're going to have to ride that one out. But at the very least, we need to rapid fire get to where we're not adding to the problem, and getting to where we're reversing some of these things, which might even add to the solution. But that's a freshwater one. And then there's sustainable modern energy for all. What does that mean, right? Sustainable modern energy for all. Well, we have to make it mean the right thing, you know, with integrity. And then there's things like inclusive, sustainable economic growth. But you'll notice even at the UN label, they cannot get out of using this word growth. If we could substitute vibrancy for the word growth, we'd begin to, I think, have a better narrative. You know, I'm all for some economic vibrancy. You know, it's important to be able to have a job and pay your bills and put braces on the kids if they need it, or save for college for them or whatnot. Everybody, you know, worldwide has those sort of basic concerns. So a vibrant economy is great. People like Herman Daly wrote the book on a steady state economy, and even like Lord what's-his-name in England just did a report on prosperity without growth at the full national government level. And so people are starting to think of this steady state economy. And even in Davos, Switzerland, it's sort of the evil empire of that economic forum, you will now hear more and more of the circular economy. Well, a circular economy, their version, is sort of like climate smart agriculture versus my biosphere smart agriculture. But the circular economy is still the right concept. You know, at Foundation Earth, we simply say, look, we need a closed loop, zero waste, sustainable production and consumption economy. Right? Closed loop, it's circular. Zero waste, we don't waste certainly not non-renewable resources, but our economy also doesn't waste renewable resources. But at least if you know, they run out, you can replenish them, right? And so that's an important part of the solution. And these UN Sustainable Development Goals don't really help us with that. But there's a danger sign. They have one in there, number 9 out of the 17, that's build resistant infrastructure. Build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. This is completely, from my not so humble and not so objective always perspective, this is the evil empire of big business making sure that they don't really have to change. Behind the scenes, lots of you have heard of the G7 or the G8 or the G6. It changes from year to year, depending on whether we like Russia or not, you know, or we're going to let China in. But there's the G20, and that's the 20 biggest economies of the planet. And at their last 3 meetings, they are trying to amass $80 trillion, not the $100 billion a year that I mentioned that the South wants from the North, you know, as payoff. But $80 trillion over the next 15 years for infrastructure projects. They've mapped out every continent. They have major projects they want to do, like the Trans-Amazon Highway in South America. They want to do the Trans-Congo Highway, right? And create the agricultural corridors and split it in half. Not good things. They want to build giant hydroelectric dams in the Congo, more than China Three Gorges, right? Which China Three Gorges series of hydroelectric dams is so heavy it's causing earthquakes, right? As well as many other problems. They want to build a complex of dams in the Congo bigger than China Three Gorges. Even the president of the World Bank, who was the head of Dartmouth University and a medical doctor, you'd think he'd be a little smarter than this, you know, but he's taken marching orders from the U.S. administration, and basically the finance ministers of the planet want to goose the global economy by another 2.5% per year of global economic growth. They realize, okay, remember my stair-step thing? We're on this level plateau, we're barely climbing again, and they want to goose it by amassing $80 trillion. And they want all your pension funds to eat, because the 20 countries with their bilateral aid don't have enough money. You add in all the multilateral development banks, like the World Bank and the other 4 or 5, and that's still not enough money. But the pension funds, they can add enough, and they could get their 80 trillion over the next 15 years. But if they put it into old paradigm infrastructure, we're screwed, right? If they build more coal-fired power plants, we're screwed. You know, if you build hydroelectric dams, you could say, well, isn't that low carbon? But if you put it in the middle of the Congo, you're wiping out the rainforest, and you're releasing, you know, those greenhouse gases, and also the eutrophication of biological material in the holding ponds puts off methane, which we know is hideous. So big hydroelectric dams are not, they're a false solution, and that's worth remembering and opposing, right? So, but getting through these UN development goals, but I want to go through this a little bit because many governments around the world do take these goals with an honor and try to work with them, particularly, of course, the European Union, you know, and their sort of general do-good nature, right? And that's a lot of clout, but not just them. Lots of other continents and governments put a little bit of muscle and money behind these, like the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals, right? So, and they even have one on lifestyle, which is not unimportant. Ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. You know, that's a big step, you know, for these international bureaucracies to begin to address that issue. I can't imagine the shit fights behind the scenes to get to this language. It sounds pretty wimpy and watered down to me, but I actually recognize that it's much tougher than what I expected to come out and provide some sense of hope, right? And then they have one on sustainably managed forests. Well, that's a frightening term. You know, why don't we just leave the old growth forests alone? They seem to know how to manage themselves. When we manage them, it usually means logging, right? And even ecologically certified logging, like Forest Stewardship Council, should not be done in an old growth forest. An old growth forest should be thought of as a non-renewable resource, like mining gold or silver out of the ground, because you cannot, You know, a pine tree plantation is not the same beast, right? And then, but that is to reverse land degradation and to halt biodiversity loss, right? That's this one. So that's pretty good language in these goals, and they're not unimportant goals. There's 17 of them. So Paris, getting back to Paris coming up, you know, they made this commitment to a multi-stakeholder dialogue. Us pushy NGOs, non-governmental organizations, social change movement of the planet, peace movement, social justice, environmental justice, you know, wilderness lovers, all the above, right, are non-governmental organizations. For Welsh, Shell and the oil companies tried to say they fit that definition because they weren't government either. They're actually meta-government, you know. They're above the government, pulling a lot of the puppet strings for virtually all political parties, north, south, east, and west, but maybe that's next year's discussion, if we're still around. So they have this multi-stakeholder dialogue, and so there's actual slightly better access for the NGOs to get in there, and a lot of the gutsy, you know, the gutsy countries in this process are the island nations of the Pacific Ocean for the most part. They know how screwed they are. I mean, they're already starting to abandon islands and line up land for their people on other continents. I mean, it's that scary, right? And so we work a lot with the island nations because they as nation-state leaders can get up in some of the forums we can't, and we collaborate on the message and the narrative. And that's how we get a lot of the gutsy things, at least out on the table, you know. And then, but the UN, you know, has a trick for that. They started issuing less credentials for the NGOs. And so this year, if you were used to getting 7 for your organization for various staff people and board members to go, now you get 2 or 3. And it's a 2-week meeting, and you can share it. One person can have it for the first week and someone else the second week. You know, so I don't even know if I'll have credentials this time to get in. It's not assured, but there's a lot you can do on the outside. At least hang a banner and go to jail or something. If you get out, you know, go to the pubs and lick your wounds, get a pint of that good European beer. You know? At any rate, I just will kind of end this sort of history, because Brennan made me promise to do this history. And by saying that, what will the agenda look like on day 1, come November 29th or 30th? I fly on the 28th, I get there on the 29th. The French just don't like it. The NGOs, the environmental groups out there, they all hate their government. Nobody's government is useful. Whereas in places like Denmark and Sweden, that's not the case, or not the current Netherlands, but typically the Netherlands. Half the government are people like us who give a shit and really want to work for authentic solutions. But not in France. The NGOs hate them. So they're going to have a massive demonstration on the 29th. That's the day I fly in. We'll have to get to my hotel on the left bank and be part of the demonstration. So who knows what happens? Maybe we'll end up in jail for a week or something. But here's the actual day 1 agenda. It starts with a high-level business address. The private sector will enlighten the governments of the world, giving them their marching orders. I'm fairly cynical about that, but I think with some reason. And then it goes on during day 1, you know, how is evolving a carbon price and a market matrix likely to impact global business operations? Is that what the deep ecologist would have put on the agenda? I don't think so, right? And what the hell is market matrix? These are code words for things that are probably not what we like. And then ensuring that attractive and functional markets drive funding into low carbon technology. So I don't know. It's a pretty business stacked agenda, but not entirely so. Sustainable agriculture and forestry and water use is on there. The word forestry, by the way, generally means logging. You know, if you're not like logging it, it's just a forest. Let's not use forestry when we mean forests. You know, forestry, and don't use that. My recommendation is, you know, call it logging. You know, there's okay logging and even maybe good logging, but there's a lot of bad logging. And when the Forest Stewardship Council was created, I argued unsuccessfully. I've had many failures in my life. But one of them was, don't call yourself the Forest Stewardship Council.
Well, call yourself the logging stewardship council. Who are you trying to steward? Steward the logging companies and the executives and the bean counters. That's who needs to be stewarded. If the forest, just get your foot off the throat of the forest. It knows how to steward itself, you know,
over millennia. But but forest sustainable ag's on the agenda. There'll be lots of us fighting for that, for the more biosphere smart version of it. And then at the closing plenary, they get into the future of climate finance, because the banks don't want to be left out of the equation. They want to know how they're going to make money, saving the planet. And that's not important. You know, one of the chief strategies is simply quit funding the bad, start funding the good. You know, more and more environmental groups are developing campaigns against banks, like at Rainforest Action Network, when we worked there. You know, we started the Citibank campaign, Citigroup. They were the largest private bank on the planet at the time. And they funded illegal logging primarily in Southeast Asia. It took us 5 years to beat the hell out of them, do civil disobedience, and give them a bloody eye in the press, and you know, black eye and a bloody nose. And they finally were on one bended knee, and we got them to orchestrate a solution. Those were some of those high-profile campaigns. But we took after Burger King in 1985 to get them to quit buying rainforest beef. We took off after Scott Paper Company, who wanted to spend $1 billion to wipe out an Indonesian rainforest on the island of New Guinea, right, and put up a eucalyptus plantation to sell toilet paper to Japan. We stopped that $1 billion project. So there are ways to fight these brush fires and connect it to this larger issue. But so stop funding the bad and start funding the good. In our Biosphere Smart recommendations to the World Bank, we just simply say, you've got to quit funding industrial agriculture because of the pollution externalities. You've got it right. Day 2 starts with engaging business in sustainable innovation. Right? But also in there is the circular economy, which may be light, but it's still in that closed loop vein that we need to move into. And you can work these circuits, right? And then towards the end of that day, something called carbon negative solutions. Who here knows what that might be? Geoengineering. How do we scrub carbon out of the atmosphere with technology? You know, or dump hordes of iron filings into the ocean that will, you know, suck it up and supposedly have no negative consequences. Or send, you know, 5,000 planes a day into the atmosphere to shoot up, spray up something that will, well, it's already being experimented with, you know, and there may be some acceptable technological geoengineerings, but we really better be careful around that stuff, because that's really scary, right? And so that's a danger sign, carbon negative solutions, right? All right, so that sort of leads to how does nature do geoengineering? And this is some of the good news and why I'm slightly hopeful about Paris. And I'll end my formal remarks here in just a minute or so. But nature's geoengineering, we are now at 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, right? Pre-industrial revolution, late 1700s. Remember England, you know, that sort of cotton stuff they did back then, coal, steam engines. We were 280, right? And you'll hear the term 350, right? Well, the term 350 and 350.org and Bill McKibben, he's heroic for starting that up. The term comes from a scientist, James Hansen, who did the calculations and said, okay, we're kind of heading towards turning our planet into Venus. But if we did the right things, we could stay below a 2 degrees centigrade average temperature rise for the planet. And that might be livable. Underscore the word might. Because when you look closely at 2 degrees, it's pretty friggin' scary. So to me, the goal is not to get back to 350, but to get back to 280. That Pleistocene, Holocene. The Holocene is, think, the last 11,000 years. The Holocene has been an unusually calm climatic period on planet Earth. It allowed for agriculture. Interestingly, the last 9,000 years. We couldn't have done large-scale agriculture before the Holocene era. I think it's supposed to go on like another 20,000 years. But we are truncating the Holocene with human-induced climate change. And that, the biggest fear for the future for me is food price wars
leading to more failed states and instability because of this climate disruption, right? We need to get back to the Holocene. Nature gave us the Holocene, and it's a relatively stable thing. We get to have it for another 20,000 years if we don't screw it up and then figure out what to do, right? And so getting back to 280 is not unimportant. Well,
How will we do that? Well, one of the first things, obviously, is quit throwing the bad stuff into the atmosphere. We're turning the blue sky into a toxic furnace. That's what climate change is. We're turning the blue sky into a toxic furnace, and that's not okay, right? We've got to get to 100% renewable energy much more quickly than these targets are that are going to be agreed to in Paris. But the targets are more bold than we would have thought over the last 3 years, so good for that. And the lesson we learned from the ozone crisis is that when we did the Montreal Protocol, it was just about chlorofluorocarbons, the stuff out of our spray cans, that turned out to have these unintended consequences that was wiping out the ozone layer that protects us from cosmic radiation. All right, the first targets were pretty wimpy, but because industry was hammering away and keeping them wimpy, that's what happened. But then better science came in, and we were able to ramp them up to a scale where they were commensurate with the scale of the problem. And now the ozone layer is back down. I don't know how far out it was, but it's back. It's healing somewhat. And that's good news. So we have to quit putting the junk up there. Well, that's the renewable energy stuff. But that's not enough. We also have to replace industrial agriculture with agroecology. When you do ecological farming, you capture a lot of that CO2 into the plants, and it goes into the roots and into the soils, right? And you could probably scrub 10 parts per million each year. If we had a magic wand and all the industrial ag were changed overnight, we know we don't have that magic wand. But if we did, and we did ecological farming globally, we would be scrubbing 10 parts per million out of the atmosphere. Now I have to double check these numbers. Some people think it's only 3 parts per million. But the good news is whatever it is on agriculture, and that's for grasslands and croplands, right? There's something like 8.3 billion acres of grasslands under management and 3 billion acres of croplands globally. And if we did it right on all of that, it's a big ticket solution. That's good news. And it protects biological diversity, it stabilizes climatic water cycles, it recharges aquifer systems. There's multiple goods from it, from that holistic solutions standpoint. And then we have to, but we also, I mentioned that we're operating on one collapsed lung, because where did all that agricultural land sort of come from? Well, it was forest. What does it mean to double the native forest canopy globally? Now we say native forest canopy on purpose. 1 more minute. I'm with you. I saw your feet. Now you're moving up front. These are I know the code.
Not so subtle.
All right. But doubling the native forest canopy really, yes, it sequesters carbon and helps us deal with this, but it will really help build a habitat to stop the extinction crisis. And we absolutely need visionary plans to do that. And so it's not just billion tree planting things. It's maybe 1 billion trees per year. I know we haven't worked out the numbers on that, but we're working on that. How many parts per million would that scrub out of the atmosphere, per year? So we have some very powerful tools in terms of solving the problem. And fortunately, they solve virtually everything on the 9 planetary boundaries, and that's the basic conditions of life. That's the laws of nature. We have to live under the laws of nature. And the finance ministers haven't quite figured this out yet. They're not with us. Most of the CEOs of the major, Fortune 500 haven't figured this out. But absolutely, there's some of them that are more enlightened. And they're working that circuit. It's not easy on their end either. And we're beginning to see action from some of the Cargills and companies that you wouldn't really quite expect. I think I've run out of pages here. But fortunately I've got, about 20 minutes of slides here. I'm not, it's just a joke. It's just a joke. That red one is a little poison arrow frog. This will be really rapid fire. You don't want to hold them on your hand. I was told afterwards. I wish I was told beforehand, damn it. But this is part of what's out there still, including indigenous peoples and uncontacted tribes. There's at least 9 uncontacted tribes out there. We have to speak sometimes on behalf of these people too, because they are not in the halls of Congress or in the corporate boardrooms or at the climate change meetings in Paris. And we try to fly them up so they can speak on their own behalf. We are not living one planet lifestyles. Our ecological footprint has to come down. This is the goal of security exchange in the world of big business, and we have to get our messages through to them. And so while the end of the world scenario will be rife with unimaginable horrors, we believe the pre-end period will be filled with unprecedented opportunities for profit. There's still a lot of that out there, damn it. We can fight it. Because that road building in the Amazon has got to stop. We have stopped a lot of it. And these people are not the ones that are, the slash and burn people are not the ones that are feeding their families, and we need to help them. When they get hired to do this, one person can cut a giant canopy tree down with that little chainsaw, and there it goes. And the cattle ranching that we fought, we have stopped, and Greenpeace Brazil is very heroic as an organization at stopping the cattle ranching in the Amazon. And there's good news we don't have time for. This was probably around 1986, where I didn't have very sophisticated maps. So I took some colored crayons of blue, well, just blue, and said, well, these are where the tropical rainforests are, and we have to save them all, goddammit. But we started organizing with that Burger King campaign. It took 18 months, and we got Burger King on one bended knee, and they canceled a $35 million contract. We had sophisticated props, like life-size cows devouring rainforests. That particular cow also defecated styrofoam clamshells out the ass end. If you want a media stunt that gets in the paper, that's the sort of potty stuff that works. But we know extinction is forever, and it's not acceptable. We do work with the indigenous peoples. These are Kayapo Indians. This is a chief that I've worked with for many, many years from the Kayapo tribe. They organize on their own behalf, and we can support them. That's me when I used to be, kind of a younger, handsome guy, at the World Bank. But I decided mountain climbing was what I wanted to do, but not Colorado style. This is the side of the World Bank. We hung this in 1985. And this vice president came out of the bank, and she looked at that sign. She said, we don't kill the rainforest. We only make loans. That's the level of disconnect. That's me again there pointing for some strange reason. And that's Mike Rozelle, who along with Dave Foreman was one of the founders of Earth First, right? And Earth First was a very powerful, important organization. And the wind is out of its sail these days for the most part, but it did some heroic stuff. This was the first civil disobedience at the World Bank. Jerry Garcia and myself sitting there at the United Nations at a press conference. They told us at the time they'd never seen more cameras at a press conference at the UN. But Jerry Garcia, and we got the Grateful Dead to help us out so we can get celebrities and rally. This was a chainsaw we put in front of the doors of the annual meeting of the World Bank, and they come out and tried to cover it up. We would run out and pull the sheets off when they weren't looking, and then we went up to Seattle for the World Trade Organization, right? And it's not, the messages aren't complex. Democracy's this way, and the World Trade Organization was that way. It's the wrong direction. We've got to ecologize democracy or die. This is another world. That's Mike Brune, by the way, who we hired to run the Home Depot campaign, and now he's the head of the Sierra Club, right, which is housed here in this great building, right? This is over in South Africa, as I mentioned. I went to jail at this one too, but that was at Citibank, but we all know the drought stuff. You guys know it out here better than most. Modern technology owes ecology an apology. Most of us haven't thought through the technology issue, but I encourage you to do so. These are the dead zones in the ocean that we don't want. But there are ways, some of them are sort of strange in terms of the solutions for big cities, right? But there are also, less high-techy versions of it. And this can be our future, and it's we had good living in the past, an Italian town. Many of us have been to these places. You know, this is a pretty low impact lifestyle way to live, and it's a dignified and exciting way to live also, right? So the Earth's life support systems, that's the laws of nature that we have to operate within. And our economies really have got to play ball with that. If we do it right, we can reverse this and save the day. That was me and Woody Harrelson sort of cut off there on the left. Where Woody Harrelson and I got arrested on the Golden Gate Bridge hanging a banner. It might have been the first one successfully ever hung on the Golden Gate Bridge. They're very good at keeping it from doing that. But this was in Sacramento, and we marched that same day, me and Woody. And also Merle Haggard was there. He's not in this picture. But, you know, you kind of see those kind of people were there, you know. And Merle Haggard, he lives in Northern California, you know. He's not from there, but he flies when he goes out and does concerts. He flies back over the forest. Well, forests in Northern California are pockmarked with clear cuts. They're ugly as shit from an airplane, right? And he didn't like that, and he joined us. So there's allies out there, man. And like I said, we can get back to the Pleistocene if we try hard. Thank you all very much for having me. I'm full of shit if you disagree. I'm serious. You know, I'll be happy to either defend myself or learn from your comments.
And we'd also like
but I have one policy, which is, you know, the first person chosen needs to be a woman.
Okay, I'm good with that.
Because we have to end patriarchy.
And then also, if anyone that's actually going to Paris this year or has been part of previous delegations has any insights they want to share or questions they want to raise, we encourage you to do that as well. There will be some great conversation afterwards, so if you guys don't have a full agenda this evening, feel free to hang back and we'll continue the dialogue. But woman first, I guess. Rachel, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Rachel.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, Rachel. So you mentioned a couple of things, a couple of the sustainable development goals.
Yeah.
One of which I think was number 11, 9 or 11, relating to the basically you kind of condensed it to the fact that it's just a push for industry. The innovation.
Was that the infrastructure? The infrastructure, yeah.
Infrastructure innovation concept.
Yeah, I mean it's more complicated.
I'm sure that it is. Do you think that might actually also be a push for clean transportation and clean technologies that'll help?
Yeah, absolutely. We could use that because there is a need for all new infrastructure should be what we could call green infrastructure.
Do you think that's
whether that's around energy systems or transportation systems or food and agricultural systems or even manufacturing stuff systems. Those are the 4 basic systems that I try to think about. If we could get our energy systems in the right direction, our transportation systems in the right direction, our food and agriculture systems in the right directions, those 3 alone would get us mostly on the way to an authentic, sustainable society, right? And that one could be pushed, but we are way outgunned by the lobby power of business as usual industry. And you can just imagine the road building companies around the world. One of the biggest dam builders outside of Brazil are Brazilian companies building hydroelectric dams around the world. And then you've got China, right? And China is trying to buy up basically Africa for ag land. They can't feed their people from China. China does not have good arable, farmable land for 1.4 billion or whatever they have these days.
And their cities haven't.
Right, and they're losing some control of that one-child family policy. They still have some control of it in cities, but not in the rural areas, right? So, at any rate, you're right that one could be shifted in the right way, but that will be a tough fight. It will start in November in Istanbul, Turkey. That's where the G20 annual meeting is, 2 weeks before the climate change meeting. And we wrote up a document, a 4-page letter to the G20, which is also on our website. If you just Google Foundation Earth, you'll find the website. and there's an email there. And if you want to get in touch with me, I read those emails. I get them. And so if there's further conversations that any of you want to have, not over the next 2 weeks, because from here I fly to Tasmania to see the second largest, tallest trees in the world, the eucalyptus down there, that are over a football field high. They're not as tall as the California redwoods, but they're actually bigger. And they're pretty powerful. But that fight will be fought, and the German Green Party is one of the ones that will be leading that fight. They have something called the Heinrich Böll Foundation with offices around the world, and they're pretty enlightened, and they at least have the venue of being elected officials in Germany where they're really championing a lot of authentic solutions, including shutting down all their nuclear plants.
Just
Follow up? Yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick follow-up. It would seem like that, with the different nations trying to meet their climate targets or their carbon reduction targets,
Yeah.
looking comprehensively at transportation from a state-by-state level, that really might be
Yeah,
the
if
big
we
push
can,
in-
like, for instance, green infrastructure includes mass transit, right? So let's not just, build another interstate highway system for trucks to truck things around. Let's rebuild the railroads and build mass transit, and make every city, quadruple the mass transit in every city worldwide. That kind of green infrastructure would help save the day, absolutely. And on the agenda for Paris is a lot more about green cities, a lot more actually. And that's in the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's one of the new developments that's positive. Yes, ma'am, and then we'll get your question.
Okay, so you're not the first person this week who's mentioned patriarchy as a planetary imperative. And so what are your ideas for the empowerment of girls and women, the education of girls and women, access to contraception? What are the big roadways that are going towards progress?
Wait, say that last part again.
What are the big roadways for progress that you see developing? Because the Islamic world, I'm not sure I see it. So tell me where you're seeing the new avenues for progress for girls and women to have more power in their society.
Well, one can come from these what are called multilateral development banks. It's where mostly northern nations put money into a bank like the World Bank, and they give it away to the less developed countries. I do think there's two categories of countries, but it's not developed and developing. It's overdeveloped and not yet overdeveloped, right? And that would be a more, I should add that to our glossary, oh, I didn't read the definition for advanced nation, I'm not gonna, but it's basically a nation that lives within its own ecological limits, and that's an advanced nation. That's the kind of language that we need to be talking about with definitions. I mean, to me, the main things that ought to be traded globally, if each continent were self-reliant, and I'll get to your question, but if each continent were 90% self-reliant, if you go back, 100, 150, 200 years, we were there. And we could go forward to that with a better lifestyle, a more dignified and diverse and enjoyable lifestyle, at least conceptually, right? And what we ought to trade globally is art, culture, and ideas. And even at a 95% level, that leaves room for chocolate and coffee, so you don't have to fight me. I'm with you, at least on the coffee part. That was good coffee. But what are the pathways for educate girls globally and that whole thing? Some of it's coming from the world of banking, where the World Bank now, the gender activists have really gotten through, and now a lot of the loans have gender requirements, and they have to show how women will be further empowered by this. And they're giving loans, including a lot of Muslim countries, right, where that's still in there.
Okay.
And how well it's on, how well it's implemented with integrity, I can't really say, but I can direct you to a real expert on that in Washington, D.C. if you want to just catch me later. And so also, in terms of providing family planning information, they haven't quite saturated the globe decently on that, but they may be a lot closer than you think. And about 2 years ago, there was a big summit in London, and a lot of foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which I don't think is helpful in agriculture, by the way, in Africa, and not doing enough things right at all. but at least on that issue, they've actually done a lot of really good things. And a lot, you know, if we had sort of 2/3 of the world covered with decent family planning availability, they reduced that gap in half. And how much it's been reduced since then, I don't know. But you know, so those are some of the pathways, you know, and I can connect you to that woman in DC and Bank Information Center, which is a group that I helped set up in '86 to spy on the World Bank, you know, is working on those gender action initiatives too. So there's a person there I can get you in touch with.
Really, thanks for a great talk and a great body of work. Thanks for being our pit bull. Although I think my proclivity is more towards border collies, but.
All right. Yeah, I hear you.
Candidly, my desire probably would be to ask an esoteric question, but I got a micro question about COP.
Okay.
This incredible revelation of VW, how is that going to affect the European stance in terms of how the talks are going to go in Paris? Because, I mean, obviously, you've got a German government who is run by the car industry, and this revelation that it's going to come that the top knew what was going on in these falsifications. It's going to have, yeah, and that's going to come. How's that? What do you think was going to happen?
Wait, because of that, I missed your first sentence. Can you just recap the question?
Sure. Just to go back, given the talks that are coming back in COP, and I'm asking a micro question.
Yeah.
This revelation in VW as
Yeah.
the falsification of data, what's that going to do to the European position? What's going to happen?
Well, it could undercut the sort of moral authority of the Greenpeace Germany. Germany had around renewable energy and hitting such high targets because of their renewable energy policy. Some of you will know it's the feed-in tariff policy that people in Colorado have been trying to champion in different cities, taking some action on that to replicate the German renewable energy policy here in the United States. And so they had a lot of cachet, and the German Green Party, I think the environment minister is still from the German Green Party there. I don't think it will undercut their climate change negotiations very much. It might in some of the more specific sections of the agreement around transportation. It may sort of distract people from, you might have a lot of people hammering on them, and there's a lot of fine point negotiations. You know how these written documents, get pretty voluminous, and they, when they're in draft form, they have these sort of sections that are, underlined where they don't have final language, and usually it gets wimped out at the tail end because the evil empire outlasts the other people, and so some of that may happen around the auto industry and transportation. I don't know. Yes, sir.
Are you aware of any elected officials in Colorado, including our U.S. folks that are going to be attending that we could?
I was with Hickenlooper in Durban, I think it was. Whether he's going again, by the way, I wouldn't be surprised if your governor is going, because he's gone to the talks before, right? And I know he lets you down out here on a number of important environmental issues, and he's undoubtedly okay on some maybe the good ones. So no, I don't know of any others.
Mayor Boulder may be going, right?
He is actually, yeah.
And Malawi.
How do we, to take it to the next step, how do you engage without a shock in society, some way of waking people up? I mean, I've got some great ideas for shock, probably politically very consequential for me, but I think it's time for the young people and us to capitalize on social media and really come out with something that people are looking for. Some radical approach, some word that goes viral on the internet that explodes to the point where the youth get engaged.
I don't know how much of internet activism, including social media, could be labeled mental masturbation. I do know anecdotally there are some really heroic accomplishments from it. right? And I'm just not close enough to it to know whether it's as useful of a tool as people hope. I suspect that it's actually not, and it's still a tool that we need to use. Absolutely. In terms of how to shock people, you know, Danella Meadows and people tried 45 years ago when the Club of Rome commissioned a report called The Limits to Growth. She said everything that needed to be said 45 years ago. Hazel Hendersons have said it, and David Browers have said it, and Teddy Goldsmiths have said it, and so many people have said it, you know, and it just that, you know, we haven't fully learned our lesson that common sense and reason are insufficient tactics and strategies to save the day. You know, we're an ungovernable species in many respects. We are capable of great good, and we have to continue to champion that side of us. But there's a real downside to the evolution of the human species. You know, greed is good for a lot of people in a sort of small-minded, day-to-day sense. You know, they don't want to make the change. There's a reason business as usual has so much momentum behind it. And I thought the extreme weather events, the Katrinas and the droughts and floods, would have, as I mentioned, would have created more of the political will that we need right now, but they haven't. However, they still might. You know, or maybe it'll be, if the next, you know, stair step down like 2008 were just 3 times worse, we're going to see some scary pictures. You know, I mean, that was a tough one. But if the next one's worse, and it may hit one continent more than others, but it has global ramifications, absolutely. All of these do. Well, you know, I love the peak oil fanatics. You know, so they're my best friends. You know, I love hanging out with the Richard Heinbergs and Post Carbon Institute, and by the way, that's I think one of the great organizations, one of the newer organizations, Post Carbon Institute. And they're sort of telling people to kind of prepare for almost a survivalist kind of thing, you know. And but whether that's really called for now or not, that bioregional self-sufficiency to me is the answer to that planetary boundaries dilemma. We need self-reliance. We need it for a number of reasons. Even if your tennis shoes were made within a 100-mile radius of here, you would know whether it was a sweatshop or not. But if my tennis shoes are made in Vietnam, I don't know whether it's still a sweatshop or not. We should foul our own nest if we're going to foul somebody's nest, not on the other side of the planet. So that's one reason why. And the feedback loops are closer. But I actually do think that it doesn't hurt to prepare for a rocky road. We don't know how this is going to play out. There are things called positive feedback loops, but they're not positive in a good sense, right? So when you lose the Arctic ice cover, you probably know all this shit, but that reflectivity of the whiteness, then becomes absorbed into the darker waters. And that then creates more global warming that melts more ice, And there's other feedback loops of that ilk. And we may have surpassed some of them already. We don't know. I'm all for serious efforts in bioregional economies knowing how to feed themselves, and working on that kind of resilience within your own home territory. It's part of that bottom-up ground solution that's important. It's hard to motivate people over that picture as thinking, I didn't come to this talk tonight saying get ready with mules and pitchforks and all of that. But somewhere in between, I do think that there's 2 reasons to do it. One, we might freaking need it to feed ourselves. We are not a resilient society. I think the figures in the San Francisco Bay Area is that, at least when I read them a couple years ago, it was 2 days of gasoline and 2 days of diesel. Right, so all your food, your Safeways, and your big stores, their deliveries run out in 3 days. Right. Where are those people going to get? If that kind of did happen virtually overnight, where are those people going to get? What are they going to do? How are they going to go bananas and try to get food somewhere? We see people talk about the water wars. are just around the corner. They're not wrong with that. They've been saying that for 30 years. What's really just around the corner and already happening are food price wars. Because we don't really pay for water daily. People buy food, so to speak, daily. You know, and food price wars are going to create more failed states and that sort of stuff. And I don't know where these failed states are going to break out. Crazy. A couple of years ago, I felt like Mexico was heading towards it. You know, I don't quite feel that way to me right now. But the failed state problem is a real problem. And again, you know, if you have bioregional self-reliance, including in those places, be it Sudan or wherever, you know, you're going to get less of that migration dilemma that we've been seeing for the last, 4 months. You know, this has been predicted years ago. The UN said the major immigration crisis will be environment caused in a fairly short period of time. So, yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say, I'm, as you probably have guessed, I'm an alarmist like you. I mean,
Excellent.
Radical at heart. And so I tend to sort of really understand the reality of what's going on, but I'm also in philanthropy, and I'm trying to get people on board.
Did you bring your checkbook?
I did. And I'm trying to get people on board to partner with us. Those folks who won't necessarily go out in the street and hold a banner, right? But that will underwrite the work that we're doing to make a difference in the world. And so what I really grapple with is really trying to, I grapple with the reality of what's going on with trying to tell good stories. And so it makes me think a lot of when I went to Flagstaff and I was working with Women's Earth Alliance.
Yeah.
And we were meeting with women who were fighting to protect San Francisco peaks there.
Yeah.
Snow wool.
Yeah.
And seeing this little tiny paper that the indigenous youth had created called Good News. All good news. It was all good stories of all the wonderful things that have been happening in the community and around the world. And I feel like those are the stories that will motivate us to keep working, right? So it's like, it's grappling with the reality of what's going on with all the good things that are going against all of that.
Sure.
So it's like I don't know exactly what my question is, but where do we sit with that, you know? That's a very weird place to sit in between with the alarmist and also there's great things happening.
Well, you know, you can sometimes be clever enough to say, God damn, there's a problem, but the solution creates a pretty exciting opportunity, right? And so with the species extinction, doubling the native forest canopy, that's a lot of jobs. It can be financed, right? And that could be youth employment for the friggin' planet, just that alone, right? And so, you know, sometimes you can take the crisis and say, look, we can confront it with just all-out freak out and fear, or we can say, you know, renewable energy is an exciting opportunity. Let's champion it. You know, ecological farming is an exciting opportunity. Let's champion it. Doubling the forest of the planet is an exciting opportunity. Let's champion it. So that's how I do it. And then behind you, and then I see, you know.
I just want to be respectful.
No, I know.
I guess mine is more looking at solutions, and it comes from the fact I have 2 sons in college. And when I talk to them and their friends about what are the things that worry them the most.
That's right after they ask you for another check.
No, actually, pretty darn good at that. But they've gone up with this, and so they may be biased. But they say to them the 2 big issues, and when I lecture at universities, I hear the same thing with kids, are the environment and having a job. But the 2 most important, they think the government is an idiot because all the stupid things we focus on. And so to me, as I hear that from the young people at universities now, what a great opportunity.
Yeah.
Because if we could get into the universities, and I see universities are very progressive, and start some real education about what they can do with their education that can give them jobs and make a difference in the environment. You know, I always say, my generation founded Earth Day and then proceeded to destroy it after that. And they really do feel like we have betrayed them. And I think that, to me, the fundamental way to change people is start with the kids and educate the kids as early as possible. And we've seen that with recycling and even on the small scale. So I don't know if your thoughts or what you're seeing out there or any perspective on that.
Well, let me be a little bit irreverent. The youth are often overrated, and they're fundamentally important. You're right. One of the best things we did at Rainforest Action Network was to create this really low-tech educational packet on the rainforest, and it got out to thousands of teachers across the country and tens of thousands of students who still come up to me from time to time. When I was in 4th grade, we studied the rainforest. It's on the Rainforest Action Network stuff. And it matters now, because we did it 15 years ago. And that does still need to happen. One of the projects that we haven't moved to the front burner yet at Foundation Earth is called a 5-star certification of biosphere literacy. Wouldn't it be nice if people finished middle school with a 1-star certification on how the world works ecologically, and high school with a 2-star, and then every MBA graduate that's going to go into business would have to have at least a 3-star certification of knowing how the world works. If we want business to be in sync with the ways of nature, we all need to have, business degree and MBAs and economics degree should have a dual degree in ecology and business, in my mind. But that's one way we're thinking of pursuing on that education, and it's specifically on helping people understand the basic laws of nature. John.
Thank you. In terms of solutions, that's one of the things we've tried to create here, is people being able to work together. Because the founding premise for this building was that problems are created one person at a time, and so are solutions. And on students, what we did last year for our Hero of Sustainability, we honored a woman named Ellen Dorsey, whom you probably haven't heard of, which is why she's so significant.
Divest, invest?
Because she's the woman with her genius created the Divest Invest movement, which you may have heard of, which is giving students a chance to go to their universities and say that you should take out of your endowment investments in fossil fuels and take that money and invest it in climate solutions. So in a certain sense, we have big issues that we all try to work on, but we have to bring it down into bite size. What can any one of us do? On the one hand, you have Ellen Dorsey, who's created a movement that's gone around the world. Unbelievable. We're trying to build a community here. So we can share ideas, we can support each other, but we can create ideally a sense of hope. Where you can come out of here and say it's not just everybody and the problems are insurmountable, there's things that we can do. This year we're going to honor on April 20th Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! Why? And what are we doing between now and April 20th, and what are we doing after April 20th? Truth in media, right? A big election year, and the amount of truth out there is really scarce. It's our responsibility, and it's our responsibility as messengers to hold ourselves accountable. We have a duty to be informed, to be properly informed, and we have a duty to have other people set a level of being properly informed. Democracy Now! Is scrupulous about its determination of factual bases. And it gets vilified by the right because it gets exposed. So that the challenge is going to be to learn from those media sources. I will never use Fox and news in the same sentence again. It's Fox, it's not news, it's propaganda. But between the alleged news and between the political ads we hear, we have a responsibility to be educated. And we can do that with students, we can do that with our peers, and first and foremost, we have to start to do that with ourselves. We're going to be creating some series of events. We're helping co-sponsor the film. Maybe you've heard of Naomi Klein and her recent book, This Changes Everything. Apparently the book was written at the same time the film was being produced. So on October 18th, it's a Sunday, in the afternoon, it's going to be the Sea Film Center. And on November 8th, if you miss it, on a Sunday afternoon, it's going to be right here. Get involved, get engaged, come join us, join the movement, join the team, find something that's bite-sized enough that you can do it. Don't be overwhelmed by the big things. We got to stop the rainforest destruction, we do. But we got to start with something that's, set your goals high enough that they're worth attaining, but not so high you can never get attain them because you'll get depressed. So stay with us hand in hand. People like Randy Hayes are, amazing motivators. People like Ellen Dorsey, people like Amy Goodman. So each of us can become a motivator. Each of us can become a leader. We're trying to create a community here where we can all do it. So please, let's all pick up a corner of the banner and raise it high. Thank you.